immigration crackdown is exposing deep divides in the Baptist church. As enforcement tightens, Baptists are split, some calling for law and order, others for mercy and refuge. When faith and politics collide, where does the church stand? Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable or panelists that we have with us today. First, we have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We also have with us Dr. Nia Johnson, who's assistant professor at Wake Forest Law School. We have Dr. Wilmer Leon, nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. And we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the director of government affairs for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Looking forward to our conversations today. It's always fun. When federal agents descended on Louisiana recently to pursue their deportation campaign, a group of Roman Catholic priests privately brought the Eucharist to the homes of immigrants too worried to step outside. But Louis Richardson, the pastor of the Woodlawn Baptist Church in Baton Rouge, planned to take an opposite approach. I would not knowingly extend communion to an illegal immigrant who is visiting our church, he said. That person would be in sin by being in this country illegally, and Christians should obey the law. Instead, the main way he would minister to them would be to help them submit themselves to the authorities. He said they should absolutely deport themselves. And Mr. Richardson's church is part of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, with about 12.7 million members. And for years, the denomination has supported immigration reforms, especially given its extensive missionary work and theological commitments to helping the least of these, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew. You know, when we take a look at these type of issues that are coming up, there are a lot of people who think this is really just a Christian nationalist conversation, or this is a particular religion. But it looks like even the Southern Baptists kind of lean a little bit left, kind of lean a little bit right. And you know, Bettina, when I take a look at these type of matters, it causes me to think that maybe there are groups that are a lot more conservative than we think they are. But we're now in a position where you don't really know where sides are. And the Southern Baptists seem to be having a real problem picking where to be. What do you do when you're in these circumstances?
Well, I think, first of all, Orland, that we all need to take about 10 steps back and look at what the fundamental problem here is. And that is that there really is no single binding Christian position on immigration policy. There's no biblical blueprint. There's no thus saith the Lord on immigration quotas or border enforcement or deportation. These are all policy judgments.
Yeah.
They're not biblical commands. And so obviously Christians are going to hold, a huge variety of opinions. Some are going to emphasize law and order. Some are going to emphasize care for the stranger. And both are drawing on these sort of biblical themes, but none of them can really claim a detailed policy blueprint. What is non-negotiable, though, I think for any Christian, is the moral core of Christianity. And that is compassion for the vulnerable. It is recognition of the inherent dignity of every single person. And that's our imperative, to love our neighbor, to recognize that every person bears the image of God. Now, how this appears within immigration policy, we can have that discussion. But if Christian communities can't have that discussion, if they are splintering along political lines, to me that says there's something way more dysfunctional going on here. And it is that political identity is getting mixed up in this conversation. And that to me is maybe the more concerning part of this phenomenon.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here. One of the things I think is worth noting here is, how dangerous ICE detention centers really are, right? Which, mind you, they are required to be habitable by law, right? Like this is not, outside of the legal purview of the United States. And I think, when we think about, what the gravity of what it means to place somebody in this position, you have to talk about the cruelty. Kaiser Family Foundation has found that over 40 people have died in ICE detention since the Trump administration has started, right? So even thinking, with a little bit more gravity about what does it mean to send somebody potentially to their death, right? Like that's a very particular thing that, like when we think about the range of beliefs in Christianity, like that is something we should be taking seriously. But one other thing I wanted to add is also thinking about the origin points of many of these religions as well, and what they've condoned in the past and in the present. I mean, if we think about Catholicism, they've had a robust history of social justice, right? So the idea of potentially going to, the home of somebody who is considered politically vulnerable, it actually may align quite nicely with the tenets that are present. However, when we think about the American religions, and I talk about the ones that really like blossomed on the soil, right? So like Seventh-day Adventism, Southern Baptist Convention, Mormons, like these are religions that also are dealing with the ramifications of Americana, right? So the foibles that American religions have, whether that's in xenophobia, in racism, in just general fear of anybody who does not look like them, that's probably going to be a tenet that shows up in aspects of their religion. And so when it's time to have some of these policy judgment decisions, naturally you're going to start to see those threads be capitalized upon in the denominations, right? And so I think that's also important to think about, okay, like let's be honest about where these religions come from and how that may inform the congregants that are there.
Leon, you're probably uniquely qualified. You're a Catholic. You're from Louisiana. This is like a Catholicism issue in a state that you know well. I mean, when you see this connecting point and then you kind of lean over into the fact that we're dealing with the Southern Baptists and we're trying to figure out how do you juxtapose all of these moving parts. And when I say moving parts, I mean moving religious parts, different denominations, trying to figure out how to operate and peacefully coexist. I mean, what are your thoughts when you see that, in particular part of the United States you're pretty familiar with?
Well, my family is from Louisiana. I was after the Great Migration West. I born in California, but we are talking about the Southern Baptist Convention, which has a deep history rooted in racism going all the way back to 1845 in the support of the enslavement of Africans and later defending segregation. Now, they have formally apologized, I think in 1995, for their past digressions, but there are still deep internal divides over systemic racist issues. And what we see here, I think, is an example of that. To me, this highlights the differences between your theology and your politics. Reverend Cohn in The Cross and the Lynching Tree says, if your theology is not about the liberation of your people, you're wasting your time. Reverend Aubrey Hendricks in The Politics of Jesus tells us that Jesus was a political revolutionary and that the uncompromising example of Jesus places upon every Christian minister the responsibility to withstand the temptation to align oneself with the secular ruling powers. So what I see Pastor Richardson doing here, he shouldn't be asking about, are these immigrants here illegally? He should be asking the deeper question that very few in this country really want to discuss and debate, which is, why are these people coming here? What is it about American foreign policy that's decimating the economies of Haiti, of Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and forcing these people to risk life and limb to come to this country? And then when he says they're here illegally, how does he know? Since American law and international human rights law requires that those at the border seeking asylum are owed a hearing before a judge. So without the due process that the law requires, how does he even know that these people are illegal?
Good point.
He's talking about the wrong things.
Melissa, what are your thoughts on this?
So, Orlin, You know, as you mentioned, I work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One of the things that I love when I go down on Capitol Hill and in meeting with the congressional office is sharing the fact that our denomination is the most ethnically, racially, and politically diverse denomination here in the United States, or faith tradition here in the United States. That means that there is not a Seventh-day Adventist position on pretty much any political issue, right? Yeah. And I love that, because I don't believe that a church should have a political position, right? I think that's what members are for. I think we're giving the gentleman who said, you know, that these people should be self-deporting, we're probably giving him a little too much clout within his own faith tradition, as far as I don't think he's uniformly representing the Southern Baptist Convention. But to say that this is the perspective of an entire faith tradition, I think is not appropriate here. And again, just from my experience with my own faith tradition.
You know, I think it's tricky, right? Like, this is a conversation that folks have in religious institutions all the time. Like, you know, when is the individual and when is the individual part of the whole, right? And that's tough, right? Because there are many times where I think religious institutions and denominations, they want to be a whole when it's convenient, and they want to be an individual when it's convenient, right? And so when you don't have folks at the top of the denomination saying, yeah, this is actually unacceptable, or this does not align with our ideals, then you're constantly kind of batting back and forth. And so when you don't necessarily take a stance on some of these issues and, like, you know, align that with your theology, whether that be, you know, in one direction or another, you do kind of open the door for these type of conversations in a way that at least 50% of the time end up unflattering to the denomination. And then you have to say, well, sorry, like, this is an individual, or sorry, this, like, is reflective of the group. So it's very complicated.
This isn't reflective of the denomination as a body, but we do know, when we listen to the political dynamics, to the political dialogue, that these trends are very prevalent still within the denomination.
So, Bettina, I think the real issue is trying to figure out, how do you find balance? Because we're talking about a split conversation, not a conversation that's totally, quote unquote, representative. And maybe the fact that we have a split conversation is already a good thing.
Well, you know, let's take it down to the personal. I think the real litmus test here is, if you find yourself sprouting political talking points and justifying those in terms of your theology, I think you're on the wrong track. Because that is where I see a lot of these conversations going. The commitment to the political identity is superseding a commitment to Christian imperatives, which is, as Christians, it should be our bottom line.
And I'm going to let that be the last word. And I think what we hope to do is to find the right balance, but also recognizing that all faiths are not monolithic, and having a split viewpoint may be what we'll see more of than less of. Coming up, a new Washington law requires Catholic priests to go against their faith by reporting abuse and neglect heard in confessionals. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. You know, there's a case that's called Etienne versus Ferguson, where Catholic priests in Washington state face an impossible choice between obeying their faith or complying with the law. Recently, there was a state law that was enacted that mandated that priests report instances of abuse or neglect that they hear about in the sacrament of confession, despite the church's longstanding teaching that confession is sacred and must remain confidential, a tradition that's been upheld for over 2,000 years. Washington law has long respected that tradition, but just as it protects private conversations with lawyers and also with others. But the state tried to single out Catholic priests while giving a pass to lawyers. Washington passed a law requiring clergy to report suspected abuse or neglect even when the information is learned during a confession. You know, Nia, when I take a look at these issues that exist in terms of things like confessions and the sacrament that confession has, in particular in the Catholic Church, and I try to juxtapose that with the law, in particular the aspect of the law that is looking to protect individuals, it seems like we may have something that does not peacefully coexist. But on one hand, this has been in place for quite a long time. Why the change in the law? And whether or not it's a good thing or it's a bad thing or it's really a transitional thing that we don't know what the final answer is yet. Just not sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I want to start off by kind of like, laying out that, churches have also always walked this line culturally of being a forum for grace and opportunity, but also from time to time, becoming a place where people who want to engage in bad behavior are being harbored, right? And sometimes, like, when we see those two interests come together, it can be really, really tricky, right? Because obviously, we can kind of sense the undertones of a stereotype about the Catholic Church here, right? And what they may be concealing, what they have concealed in the past, and whether the law should intervene in that process. And I think that's like, quite complex on its own. I also think this is a really interesting theme, and it's something that we talk about a lot on this show, which is what happens when states actually ask for religious organizations to participate in the desires and needs of the state, right? And that's not only in ways of like, constricting people's religious beliefs, but it's also, we see this in cases when we talk about parochial schools receiving funding from the federal government, right? Like we have public school issues, parochial schools have been able to step in the gap, and then now we kind of walk into these challenges. In the same way, if you have a denomination that holds sensitive information, right, and sensitive information that we don't even allow for medical providers to hold on to as well, right? Like, we could talk about this in the context of lawyers, but we require medical providers, if there is some indicator that an individual can hurt somebody else, in some cases, they do have to disclose, right? And so now you kind of have a denomination that sadly kind of fits kind of in the crevices of this, where the state has an interest in making sure that if something harmful is happening to individuals, that the state is aware. But on the other hand, this is something that is quite sacred and it is a sacrament. And so, I think this is always, a recurring theme of when we see institutions kind of like inch up on the parameters of churches, but also have like a state interest in a reason.
So, I agree, Nia. I think that this is a very complex area of law and also of, of social theory, I guess. But I think the bottom line is always that when a child is at risk, there is a compelling state interest in protecting that child. But again, as Nia said, the seal of confession, it's not incidental to the Catholic teaching. I think we need to really grapple with the fact that this seriously does represent a burden to religious liberty. We need to grapple with the seriousness of that. I think for me, and I'm going to be interested to hear what our Catholic panelist has to say about this, but for me personally, I believe that law has a normative purpose as well as a reactive purpose. So normative in the sense that it sets expectations for society. And so a law that reflects the paramount need to protect the welfare of a child, I think, to me, is expressing the right value that we want to have as a society. Having said all that, I understand, the very complex religious liberty issues that this also raises.
Well, as the resident Catholic on the panel, first of all, it's important for people to truly understand the significance of confession as it relates to the Catholic Church. You're seeking mercy, you're seeking reconciliation. That's what's done during the process of confession, and that is completely confidential. In fact, as far as the church doctrine goes, eternal damnation and automatic excommunication from the church are what falls upon any priest who breaks the confidentiality of confession. Wow. I think it's also important to realize here that all the Catholic priests in the state of Washington were and still are required to report to law enforcement any suspected instance of abuse, with the exception of confession. So the question then becomes, why was the Catholic Church singled out in the state of Washington? And I think that there are two elements of this. One is the Catholic Church put itself in the bullseye based upon its practices we are all very much aware of over the years, and the manner in which it refused to police itself and hold many of those violators of children responsible. And the second part of this, I believe, has to do with Governor Ferguson, who in Washington State, who has a history of pursuing the Catholic Church for transparency as it relates to those past incredible transgressions. So I think that's why we find ourselves in this circumstance with the state of Washington and the Catholic Church. And in this instance, I think the court finally worked out the sensible, reasonable conclusion.
Yeah, I agree with Wilmer 100% as far as I think the court ended up in the right place. Washington State actually, withdrew the requirement or didn't enforce it. I guess it was just about to be enforced and it wasn't enforced. I think that's the right decision here. And I very much appreciate what the church must have been wrestling with as far as wanting to protect the most vulnerable. Again, recognizing that there is the history in the past of unexcusable behavior. And so having a requirement of reporting and even reporting of suspected abuse, and that's not under state law. That's under the Church's diocese there. And so wanting to be better, but also wrestling with the fact of this is something that we believed spiritually, innately is a sacred space. It seemed like it really is trying to find the appropriate way to engage there. I agree that this is not the place for the state to step in and deal with the religious beliefs or functions of an organization. So I think that it landed on the right side here.
I also want to zero in just really quickly on Wilmer's point about self-monitoring, because I think this also is a teachable moment for religious institutions as well, where, we talk a lot on this show about what's happening in the courts and also some of the factors that have brought cases to the courts. And a lot of them have to do with the reputation that some religious institutions have in the public zeitgeist. And no institution is perfect, right? Many of the foibles we see in churches are the foibles we see in schools, right? Or the foibles we see in hospitals. So it happens. But I do think there's something to be said when leaders of denominations actually decide, what are going to be the parameters within our institutions? Like when do we decide that we are going to potentially police people in our own denominations so the state does not always have to respond to us with hostility, right? Because now, for the average individual consuming this case, it's hard to tell the line between concealment and religion, right? And now you're kind of forcing something into the public discourse that may not belong there in that context. And had the religious organization policed itself from the beginning, then the courts may not have felt necessary to even intervene, or the legislature may not have felt it necessary to intervene.
That is a brilliant point, Nia, and I agree. I also want to make the point, which is kind of related, that religious organizations, and I am a champion of religious freedom. That is what I do for a living. But I think we would do well to remember that the right to act on our religious beliefs when it causes harm, tangible harm to others, is not unqualified. And, we see this, for instance, in the way the courts have dealt with issues of parental withdrawal of children from medical care, for instance, based on religious beliefs. So the courts in those cases say, yes, we respect religious freedom, but the welfare of the child takes precedence in that case. So, as we are grappling with this very difficult issue, I think our bottom line needs to be, and as Nia reminded us, as members of religious organizations, we need to hold ourselves to a high level of accountability on how we protect the welfare of children. The bottom line has to be, what is in the best interest of the child? What will protect a vulnerable minor. And, you know, I think we need to recognize that there are limits at times to our ability to act on our religious beliefs when that harm is in play.
I think a lot of people don't realize that the law has stepped into a number of areas it probably did not want to step into, but it saw that the church was not necessarily allowing things to be done in a way that seemed fair and, you know, and not harmful. And as a result, many instances, that's why, you know, government decides to step in, because the church in policing itself seems like it's not being quote unquote fair.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if we want to even put it in the context of fair as we want to put it in the context of right, because the policies and the practices that the church was, and even in many instances still continues to engage in terms of protecting violators, and in some instances, it has a monetary motivation. We don't want to get sued. We don't want to pay no. You have erred on the wrong side of this issue, and you're protecting the wrong individuals, and the rights of children always need to be protected.
I'm gonna let that be the last word, but I think the point that we're all kind of alluding to is looking out for the least of these and protecting them at the highest level is something that I don't think you can never come back and push back and say, well, we can't do that because that violates our religion, when the foundation of most religions are looking out for individuals who are in need of help. Hey, Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orland, did you know that wearing a necktie can reduce blood flow to the brain by 7.5%, according to a 2018 study? It can also make you feel dizzy, nauseous, and causes headaches. And I think that's why neither you nor I are wearing neckties.
That's my new excuse. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, I was so disappointed recently to find out that the national animal of Scotland is not the Loch Ness Monster, but it is actually, I was delighted to learn, the unicorn.
Okay. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So did you know that one of the most expensive Democratic primaries in history happened in North Carolina? In 2025, the Democratic primary between Valerie Fouché and Nita Alam was definitely the most expensive.
Did not know that. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin, we're taking it back to Washington State. Did you know that the game or fad, depending on your perspective, of pickleball was invented in Washington State back in 1965, and it is now, in fact, the official sport of Washington?
I didn't know that. Always learn something new. Really appreciate being here with you guys today. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.